On January 24, 1871, about 25 Kiowas attacked a wagon train manned by Johnson and two black teamsters 4 miles east of Salt Creek in Young County. A group of nearby teamsters from a larger train of wagons reported that Johnson died last in a desperate defense behind the body of his horse. Teamsters who buried the mutilated bodies of Johnson and his men counted 173 rifle and pistol shells in the area where Johnson made his last stand. He was buried with his men in a common grave beside the wagon road. But who exactly was this black cowboy, who only a few years after the end of slavery managed to defend his life in an epic Hollywood-esque last stand? And why is his death the most accurate description of him? Don't be no yellow belly and hit that subscription button and hit the notification bell while you're at it, and catch each new episode hot as a bullet shell. West Texas has always been a place of great vastness, heat, and strife, of awesome lightning storms and monstrous tornadoes, of confounding isolation, an immense area of land scattered by lonesome farmers and ranchers, a hell of a place in both its appearance and weather, where only the bold and most free of people yearning for unrestriction and space have gone to make themselves a living. But back in the 1800s, this area of North America was pretty much just that, hell. The leastest of places a human being would want to venture, and the perfect place to get away from everything. Daring folk were the types of people that moved here in those days. One might say they were crazy, stubborn, ignorant, or even wild, but nearly all of them were devout Christians with a religious fervor and an immense faith in God. But they weren't the only ones living here. Comanche and Kiowa Indians had had a strong presence in the southern plains since the 17th century, a large plains country stretching all over Texas, Colorado, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Kansas. From here, the warfaring tribes would often ride out into the rest of Texas and predate on the lonesome ranching communities and the townships. Young County, Texas lies at the northern part of Texas near the Red River that divides Texas from Oklahoma and at the edge of the southwestern North American plains that the Kiowa and Comanche roamed for hundreds of years. This is where Britt Johnson and his family lived when a Comanche and Kiowa raid of several hundred strong attacked on the bloody morning of October 13, 1864, what is now known as the Elm Creek Raid, killing several people and riding away with hostages, Britt's wife and 2 daughters among them, taken atop a horse and ridden hard to their sanctuary in the ocean-like plains just west. What is known about Britt Johnson before the raid of Elm Creek is very little, but it is known that he was probably born in Tennessee around 1840 and had eventually made it down to Texas as a slave, where his master, a Moses Johnson, had at some point in time given him his freedom. He served Moses Johnson as a foreman in his ranch and was allowed the privilege to own and raise his own horses and cattle. Needless to say, Britt Johnson was a natural cowboy in all the word's definition. He and his wife lived in a ranching community near the mouth of Elm Creek in Young County, where they and their 3 children lived among a handful of white ranching families. A peaceful existence until it was violently cut short on the eventful morning of the attack. The narrator, H.C. Williams Sr., proclaims he was about 7 years old at the time of the events, and he, along with his family, lived in the same ranching community near Elm Creek. It is one of many narratives of what happened back in October of 1864, and in fact, most of what is known today of the Elm Creek raid and Britt Johnson comes from pure oral history, meaning that almost no official documentation was either made or survives of the event when it happened, all of it spiraling and losing itself in tale, into legend and into myth. When Britt arrived from a trip he and a neighbor had taken to a nearby trading post for supplies, they discovered the horrific aftermath of the raid. According to Mr. Williams, 11 settlers had been killed and 7 were taken captive. Britt arrived to find his 12-year-old son buried, his wife and daughters taken. The Indians had killed his son out of a resolve as to who would keep him, so they settled it by killing him, leaving him dead in the dirt where he could cause no more dispute. This tragic event most likely happened because of the boy's value. It was October of 1864, after all, only 7 months before the end of the American Civil War. A black boy of 12 years old could yield up to hundreds of dollars in the slave markets, something Native Americans were quite aware of in that time. Though the rhetoric goes that natives didn't care much for money, they did however care for horses, rifles, and ammunition that they could buy from whites or Mexicans. In those later years of the 19th century, tobacco, liquor, coffee, and modern utilities had become quite popular with many Indian tribes. Only money could help them afford that from the world. Britt mourned his son, and a short while after made the decision to go find his wife and kids. Before leaving, his neighbors supplied him with supplies for the journey: blankets, cookingware, clothes, food, money. He took along with him pistols and rifle, and a lot of ammunition. The days were hot, the nights were cold, water was always scarce, and the enormity of the plains seemed to have no end. A raised mass of land in the middle of nowhere, where it seems like another world on earth. A Mount Olympus sheltering its gods of wrath and all. Brit Johnson, a Western Hercules. The months passed up in the high Texas plains, and many details have been muddled throughout time as to how Britt found his wife and children and rescued them, along with some of the other captives taken earlier in October. But one thing remains almost certain. Brit Johnson could communicate with the Indians in Comanche and Spanish. Spanish had been the language of the Southwest for hundreds of years, alongside the native tongues of the many tribes scattered throughout the plains, forests, deserts, mountains, and prairies before the arrival of other European languages. The long, bitter months well exposed out in the elements eventually paid off. Brit Johnson learns the whereabouts of his family. They are at the hands of the Kiowa. The Kiowa of Texas shared many similarities with the Comanche, and often both warring tribes liked to join up during raids. Their cultures were very similar, but not altogether. Patiently scheming and deceiving the red man into his friendship, Brit Johnson learned from his new Comanche brethren the Kiowa way and their customs of trade. Whether he took several trips throughout the first half of 1865, or was just simply living in the high plains, in June of '65, Brit Johnson managed to ransom his wife and 2 little girls back, along with the ransom of other captives. One captive, Millie Durgan, who was only a toddler when she was taken, was never returned to her family members. A Kiowa chief had taken her into his family and adopted her as one of their own. She grew up fully Kiowa, dying at the ripe old age of 75 in an Indian reservation up in Oklahoma. Old Brit Johnson returned to his home as a hero, Apparently, Britt had always been well known for his marksmanship with a fire weapon, and his admirable skills as an orderly, or a messenger boy, out in the wild country. This was just a cherry on top of his fame. But his legacy did not end there. If one goes to findagrave.com and searches for Britt Johnson, on the description of his burial site, section 1 can read, "The exact location of the final remains of these three men is a secret due to past excavations by visitors to the gravesite. The site is on private property. No trespassing signs are posted." A natural question that would pop up in anyone's mind upon reading this would be, why on earth would anyone want to dig him up? The story of how he made his final stand and of the 170 bullet shells might be an answer. Perhaps to retrieve one of those legendary shells, or a remnant of old Britt, as an omen of warriorhood and courage. On that day of January 1871, Britt and two of his partners were traversing Indian country on a freight business errand. The story of the attack seems to vary in every account. Almost every account state that Britt was found dead behind his horse, whose throat he had cut in order to use the animal as a sword of breastworks. Some of the accounts proclaim that all three men's horses were found this way, supposedly at Britt's command, having been the most experienced out of the three, and that all three suffered the same fate. Yet, other takes on the story say only Britt's remains were found behind his dead horse, surrounded by the evidence of his desperate last stand, and that his partners were found a bit further from Britt, suggesting they chose flight instead of fight. All accounts mention the mutilated bodies of the three men. One account states that Britt was found disemboweled, with the remains of a little dog that had accompanied the men thrust into the inside of his stomach. The three dead cowboys were buried at the spot of their death alongside the trail. Brit Johnson's story is a West Texas legend, equivalent to the myths of ancient Greece, its oral kept history enriching the deeds of the man. One could easily dismiss Britt's mythological proportion as that of a man who made a daring journey, succeeded, and then got himself killed. Then again, how many men in the old and untamed West didn't do the same thing? But I say his story is much more than just that. Brit Johnson's story is of a unique black man in the time of slavery, who had had the blessing of freedom to exist freely around his white master and white neighbors. It's the story of a black cowboy in Texas that had gained renown for his business savvy and gun skills. It's the story of a man who did not depend on authorities to rescue his family in a scenario that most of us in modern times cannot even fathom. A tragic thing worthy of complete panic and utter agony. It is the story of a man's last stand and his wits and courage against the Plains Indians, the most ferocious beings since perhaps the Spartans. It's the story of a black man who stands out in a time and place in history when his people's histories were for the most part ignored and untaught.